Getting into David Lynch's films can be a bit like getting into coffee for the first time. For me, I started with the original run of Twin Peaks, which I would say is kind of like a cup of coffee filled halfway up and then topped with flavored creamer and additional sugar. It's sweet and delicious, and you know you're going to have fun watching it.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
But there's still that bitterness there, that strangeness in the back of your throat. And on the other side of that spectrum is Twin Peaks: The Return, which is like a pot of black coffee in a diner that's been sitting on the burner for 18 hours. And that is by no means a knock against The Return, by the way. On January 16th of 2025, the world lost one of the most inventive directors in film history, David Lynch. And that's no hyperbole. Lynch was a true visionary, and I don't think that there are any film fans out there that could deny the impact that Lynch's career will have on film history moving forward. It's hard to try and even talk about David Lynch, because where do you begin? Do I tell you that he was born in Missoula, Montana in 1946? Do I just list off Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive, Lost Highway, Eraserhead, and Elephant Man as evidence of his genius? Do I break down his career film by film? Do I talk about how much his cast and crew adored him? Do I talk about Roger Ebert's infamous Blue Velvet review? And I could go on and on, listing out all of the amazing things that stand out in David Lynch's career. But is that really what any of us want? And doing a mini biography of David Lynch where I vomit up factoids about his career does sound like fun, but I just don't think that's what David Lynch would want. He wanted his legacy to be his art, not for his art to be dissected and discussed. In Lynch's mind, the work is the conversation. Aside from that, there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of video essays on David Lynch's career and trying to decipher Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive or Lost Highway or any other movie in his filmography. For me, my real interest in David Lynch stems from the work and the way it makes us feel. The way he refused to hold his audience's hand and the way he taught us all how to dream. My introduction to David Lynch came from a pretty unlikely place. A friend of mine's band used a sound clip from Fire Walk With Me before a track on a split 7-inch they released, and it was so eerie and odd that I was immediately interested. And then I started to see things about Twin Peaks on Tumblr back when that was a thing, and finally in 2012 I sat down and started Twin Peaks. And with Twin Peaks, I think it's almost a rite of passage to not finish the full show in one go round. Once I found out who killed Laura Palmer, I stopped watching for about 6 months before finally coming back and finishing the show. And then I just didn't really engage with any other Lynch material for a few years. Weird, right? I think I loved Twin Peaks so much, and what I'd seen from Lynch's other work just seemed kind of pretentious, and I also had this weird notion that his other films were very much focused on body horror, which is hilarious in retrospect. While obviously there's some body horror stuff in Eraserhead, to call Lynch a body horror director is straight up laughable. At any rate, I didn't engage with Lynch again until my wife and I got together a few years later.
My wife!
When I showed her Twin Peaks. And then we tried to watch Fire Walk With Me, but I accidentally downloaded The Missing Pieces, which is actually a feature-length compilation of all the deleted scenes from Fire Walk With Me, which we watched for like a full 90 minutes before realizing it wasn't the actual movie. I still get mad when I think about it. Although what's funny is that now whenever I do go back and watch Fire Walk With Me, I always forget that some of the scenes that stick out to me the most actually come from The Missing Pieces and not Fire Walk With Me. Specifically, the fight between Chester Desmond and the sheriff at Deer Meadow. Also, the 2x4 scene with Pete, Josie, and the bank manager is fucking hilarious, and it's something I think about all the time.
I want a 2x4!
Which is kind of interesting. Maybe I should go back and rewatch The Missing Pieces. Let me know in the comments if that's something you guys would be interested in. Anyway, I think this was another thing that soured me on Lynch a little in the beginning, because The Missing Pieces without context is a fucking slog. Especially when you think you're watching a movie and there's little to no narrative thread holding the entire thing together. So fast forward a couple years later and Twin Peaks: The Return comes out, and you guys, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Upon first viewing, I thought this was one of the most self-indulgent, pretentious pieces of shit that I had ever seen. And then it seemed like every critic or movie podcast I listened to were all praising it as one of the best shows of all time and the perfect conclusion to Twin Peaks and possibly even David Lynch's career. Now, I'm not one of those people that doubles down when someone has a different opinion than I do. I'm the opposite. I like to go back and check and see if I still feel the same, and with movies in particular, it's very common for me to go back and rewatch something that I either loved or hated initially and have a completely different read on it the second time. And The Return was no exception, because once I rewatched it, I started to get it a little little bit more. My expectations for what the show was going to be had been shattered, and I began to love the show that Lynch gave to us. Then after rewatching The Return, I dove into his filmography, and much like The Return, a lot of it I did not connect with at first. Like when I first finished Mulholland Drive, I knew it was great, but I also knew that I didn't understand a fucking thing it was trying to say. And that's when I really started becoming fascinated by David Lynch. I watched almost all of the movies in his filmography. I started watching interviews with him and interviews with the casts that he'd worked with, all talking about him, and as I began to peel back the layers of who David Lynch was as a person, his work started to make more and more sense to me. Now, I don't think you need to know David Lynch's entire biography to understand his movies, but it certainly doesn't hurt either. For me, what really unlocked David Lynch was learning about his background growing up in the suburbs and how he viewed the darkness behind the picket white fences of the suburbs, and his love-hate relationship with the city of Philadelphia. But if there's one thing that every person who sees a David Lynch movie should know, it's that every day, twice a day, for over 50 years, David Lynch would meditate for 20 minutes. To talk about David Lynch and not mention transcendental meditation would be a mistake and honestly a disservice to his memory. His great passions in life were art, coffee, cigarettes, and meditation. And when you hear Lynch talk about meditation and how he would catch ideas and how he loved to experiment, the view of his work begins to open up a bit. Maybe his work isn't meant to be taken literally, or maybe it is. Maybe that's for you to decide. And the other thing that I learned about Lynch that really unlocked his work, it was his love of dream logic and storytelling. I won't get too deep into it here, but I have this really cool David Lynch shirt that has his entire filmography on the back. And it comes with this really cool quote on the back that says, "I don't know why people expect art to make sense. They accept the fact that life doesn't make any sense." And I always think about this famous clip where he refers to Eraserhead as his most spiritual movie, and when asked to expand on that, he simply says no. And to me, that's who David Lynch was as a filmmaker. He might tell us a little bit about what a film means to him, but for the most part, he left it up to us. We're grown-ups. What do these ideas and visual themes say to us? Do they make us uncomfortable? Why do they make us uncomfortable? David Lynch's work doesn't just wash over you, it confronts you head on with the ugliness of the world and then asks you to laugh at it and find the beauty behind the ugly. Getting into David Lynch's films can be a bit like getting into coffee for the first time. For me, I started with the original run of Twin Peaks, which I would say is kind of like a cup of coffee filled halfway up and then topped with flavored creamer and additional sugar. It's sweet and delicious, and you know you're going to have fun watching it.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
But there's still that bitterness there, that strangeness in the back of your throat. And on the other side of that spectrum is Twin Peaks: The Return, which is like a pot of black coffee in a diner that's been sitting on the burner for 18 hours. And that is by no means a knock against The Return, by the way. But I do think that's why I had such a hard time going from the original Twin Peaks into The Return. I hadn't tried any other coffee. My palate wasn't ready. But after watching nearly everything else David Lynch has directed, I still haven't seen a few of his shorts or On the Air, which was the show that Lynch and his creative partner Mark Frost did after Twin Peaks was canceled. But anyway, now that I have a full picture of his career, it makes me appreciate all the various flavors of coffee he gave to us over the years. I think everything in Lynch's filmography has some sort of sweetness and bitterness built into it. David Lynch had a fascination with the balance between light and dark, that you cannot have light without darkness. The darkness isn't really anything, it's the absence of light and color. And I think it's this balance that he struck that made Twin Peaks stand out to me in such a real way. We see this wholesome town, but all the high school kids are either doing drugs or dealing drugs. There's a full and widespread underage prostitution ring. There's a bar where high school kids hang out and drink freely. And just the overall feeling that the town is not as wholesome as it presents. Realistically, the entire show is about Cooper being drawn in by the wholesomeness of Twin Peaks, only to be betrayed by it and turn towards the darkness. Okay, I know I promised not to dissect Twin Peaks and what it's about, so I'll just leave it there. I've said in past videos that I love dream logic and storytelling, and that can be tied back directly to David Lynch and Twin Peaks specifically. For me, there is no set piece across any other work of fiction that captures my imagination quite like The Red Room. Something about the simple elegance of it combined with the backwards speak make it feel so otherworldly. Like the season 2 finale of Twin Peaks is probably my favorite episode of the entire series because half of it is just Cooper running around the Red Room and being creepy as fuck. And the Red Room is just the ultimate example of simplicity. And as someone that's done a lot of producing, I appreciate how budget friendly this otherworldly set is. It's literally just some red curtains, a couple of chairs, and a chevron patterned carpet, but the simplicity combined with the weirdness of the backwards speak and Angelo Badalamenti's score or, I mean, it's pretty fucking compelling, right? My point is that as a filmmaker, David Lynch taught me that there is so much more to storytelling than just the words on the page and the actions the characters take. Like, for so long, I was obsessed with solving Twin Peaks and Mulholland Drive and really trying to figure out what happens in them. And I do think I have a solid grasp on the story of both, but then I see people post hour-long video essays diving into the meaning of these stories and trying to dissect them bit by bit, word by word, and I just know it's not what David Lynch would want from any of us. It's what makes Lynch one of the most fun directors to talk about, because everyone appreciates his work to varying degrees, and maybe they make connections with something that you don't connect with at all, and these moments have sparked so many friendships and conversations for people over the years. And speaking of friendship, if I'm being honest, I feel like those that were lucky enough to be friends with David Lynch will always jump to talk about their friendship with Lynch long before they bring up working with him. Sure, he was a genius and he was kind and odd and everyone loved working with him, but when you see his cast and crew talk about him, it's their friendship and the love they shared with him that they want to talk about, because the work speaks for itself. The work is the work, but the real legacy is their friendship with David Lynch. David Lynch had these long-standing partnerships with so many of his collaborators, and in the weeks and months since his death, it's been heartwarming to see all of them come out and talk about their love of David as a person and how much they adored him and how much they'll miss him. Throughout his career, Lynch got a bad rap for being a director with a lot of violence in his films, and sure, there is a lot of violence and grotesque imagery to be found in his movies, but if you actually look at his films, you'll see that the violence was only ever there in service of the story, to show us the darkness of the world that Lynch had brought us into. And if you listen to his casts talk about working with him, specifically the women who've worked with him, none of them ever once felt exploited. Isabella Rossellini has said publicly that she and David find the grape scene from Blue Velvet to be hysterical, and while I don't find it as funny as they do, I think it's an important thing to call out, especially with how hard critics like Roger Ebert hated Blue Velvet upon its release. And even after her and David Lynch's romantic relationship ended, she would still always talk about how much she loved him when asked, and she even wore a beautiful blue velvet dress to the Oscars this year to honor David Lynch. We will never see another filmmaker like Lynch, not only because the way Hollywood works has completely changed in the last 20 years, but because there simply cannot be another David Lynch. He had a voice that was uniquely his own. It's the reason the phrase Lynchian even became a thing, and even though I think most people use it incorrectly, it's undeniable that plenty of filmmakers working today take inspiration from David Lynch, but none of them are trying to be David Lynch. Because that's what Lynch taught us as a filmmaker. Be yourself. Do the weird thing. Do the thing that makes sense to you. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as it feels authentic to you. And I hope that's a legacy that David Lynch would be proud of, that he inspired people to think for themselves, to come up with unique ideas. And for storytellers, I feel like he taught us how to balance challenging and inspiring an audience all at once. Rest in peace, David Lynch, and thank you for teaching all of us how to dream. I'm Brandon, and this is Born to Rant. If you've made it this far into the video, let me know in the comments what your favorite David Lynch movie is. What made his movies connect for you? Do you think The Return should be considered a film? I do. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We release new videos every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, bye-bye.